Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. We are doing special podcasts this week because a bunch of us are away, and so we are pre-taping. And today's podcast, we are going to dedicate to the topic of our favorite biographies. What biographies have we read in the course of our lives that have meant the most to us? I'm not now here talking about the greatest of biographies. I mean, there are books that sort of you can name as like legitimately great works of art that are biographies. Obviously Boswell's Life of Johnson being probably the most famous, or Plutarch's Lives, or Alan Bullock's legendary biography of Hitler. So here I'm not trying to sort of figure out what is the best biography ever written, just maybe what biography meant, or biographies. You don't have to hold to one if my fellow panelists here don't wish to. And those panelists, of course, are executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
So, Christine, you are up first with your favorite biography or fees.
Okay, I'm glad, by the way, that we can pull a John like we do with like you do sometimes with recommendations and add a few, because it's a difficult assignment. I don't read a ton of biographies. I suspect you all have read far more political biographies. I have a favorite political biography, which is Gene Edward Smith's biography of Eisenhower, which I think is fantastic. But I tend to read literary biographies. I like to read about the lives of the writers I like. One of my favorites is R.W.B. Lewis's biography of Edith Wharton, which is wonderful. But I was thinking it's summer reading. Maybe people don't want to dive into, 400 or 500 pages on the life of Edith Wharton. So Lewis actually wrote a really slim, a couple hundred-page biography of Dante, which is what I want to recommend. It's because not only is it give you some of the context and life of Dante, it also does a interesting, very elegant read of the comedy, Divine Comedy, and in that sense, it's extremely useful if you read the Divine Comedy as a college student, or you've never read it. It's an interesting introduction, I think. Very, very slim. I think it's part of the Penguin Live series that came out early 2000s. So that's my recommendation. Although if you're more ambitious and you like Edith Wharton, please go read his equally excellent biography of Edith Wharton.
By the way, quick note about the biography of Edith Wharton is that it was the research assistant on R.W. Lewis's biography, and thought to be pretty much the co-author of the book, was David Milch. David Milch then went on to create NYPD Blue and Deadwood, and it was a fascinating character, sadly now afflicted with Alzheimer's, but he would go from being his research assistant at Yale during the day to like heroin dens and gambling holes at night. But I mean, that is a fascinating road not taken had David Milch like remained an English department figure rather than a major cultural figure. Anyway, so that's a great recommendation. Matt, what do you got?
Sure. Well, like Christine, it occurred to me that I actually read many more memoirs than I read biographies, but I do have a political biography, and Christine's also inspired me to think of a literary biography I will recommend. So I'll recommend two. The political biography, it's a slim book, very accessible. It doesn't seem to be in print, which alarms me, but this is Paul Johnson's biography of Churchill that came out in 2009. In hardcover, and is also, if you can find a used copy, on paperback. There are many, many biographies of Churchill. I've dipped into a lot of them. Typically, Churchill biographies are massive, and it's easy to get lost. What's nice about Paul Johnson's biography of Churchill is it is short. It has the quality of brevity, but it covers all of Churchill's life, and it does so in Paul Johnson's wonderful style that carries you along and offers insights. So that's my political biography recommendation. For literary biography, I admit I have not read the whole thing, But about 10 years ago, I came across a reference in a Joseph Epstein essay to Leon Edel's uh, biography of Henry James. It's 5 volumes long in the original. He then did a 1-volume abridgment that also came out. And it's as though Henry James wrote a biography about Henry James. Um, and it's just an amazing work of literature, first of all, but also psychology and the history of the James family, which is so interesting into its own right. And it's a book that I do, all 5 volumes I do kind of go back and kind of dip into it for pleasure and insight just on occasion. Just 3 pages of Leon Edel's biography of Henry James bring just great satisfaction to any reader, I think.
You mentioned Paul Johnson's biography of Churchill, and when I was trying to think about what I would pick, one of the first things that came to mind was Andrew Roberts' biography of Churchill, which came out 4 or 5 years ago. And Andrew is a friend of mine, so I have to note that. Though Paul Johnson was also a friend of mine, so I should note that as well. That is a doorstop of a book,
Right.
Andrew's biography of Churchill. But it is absolutely an astonishing piece of work, and one of the few books of its length that I can recommend wholeheartedly, because just a little background on how a biographer works. I've never understood how guys like Andrew are able to write a book that size in 2 years or 2.5 years. Then he wrote one about Napoleon. Then he wrote one about King George III. This is all in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And he explained to me that he spent 3 years, 2 years doing a chronology of Churchill's life from the day of his birth to the day of his death. Uh, and had it in a gigantic book. And when he found notes, letters, this, that, the other thing, he would insert them on the days that were corresponding to what he had in this outline. And then when he had this all done and had Churchill's life all down in his brain, it took him 8 months to write the book. So that's that's superhuman. I don't understand it. I don't understand how anybody pulls it off, but you can see the clarity of the book and the kinds of things that he focuses on, which include a lot of Churchill's very interesting personal upbringing, and the neglect of his beloved mother in particular, which was agonizing to him, and how it had affected the way that he was himself a very loving father and stuff. Anyway, that's a pretty amazing book, but it is obviously the polar opposite of the short, sharp Plutarchian biography that Paul Johnson wrote of Churchill. Seth, what do you got?
So I have 2, but mostly I'm going with David McCullough's biography of Harry Truman, because I the things that we all loved about David McCullough's books are, especially worthwhile with the Truman book, because he wrote with a kind of, there's a sense of wonder at some of the things that he would write about. McCullough sort of seemed to be really enjoying the amazing quality of American history, and that works really well with the Truman book, because Truman was that way too. He was a non-college graduate who had self-educated by reading biographies. And so the biography, the grand biography of the great president whose entire education was reading other great men's biographies, is it was a good theme, but also McCullough is able to capture the voice in a way that reminds me of a speechwriter, how you have to catch the voice of the person you're writing for. And there are points in the book where you sort of just feel like you're sitting around a fireplace and Harry Truman is telling you these stories. It just has that kind of folksiness without losing the wealth of material. I mean, it's not, it's a what 900 page plus index and whatever book. So it's a bit of a doorstop, but it's highly readable. And also the story of Truman in general is just the story of this kind of miraculous moment when this this Midwestern American was just kind of plucked out and was, turned out to be just what the doctor ordered for this country. It was just his values that he had to go on. He was part of a political machine. He didn't really have an ideology. He didn't really have an extended education. He just had these things that Harry Truman felt were right and following his gut and his conscience. And it came at this incredible hinge moment, in the middle or near the end of a world war. And Harry Truman had to sort of rebuild the government, the defense establishment, the White House physically itself, right? And as he was staying in I guess it was the Blair House, while he was fixing the White House, there was an attempted assassination. Two Puerto Rican nationalists tried to kill him while he was out of the White House because he was fixing up the White House. When he moved in, there were rats the size of cats at the tables outside and stuff. And at one point, a piano nearly fell through a floor in the White House. I mean, it was run down. Harry Truman sort of built up everything physically and intellectually at the moment that we were launching into the Cold War. And so it was just this kind of miraculous, great, incredible American moment. And McCullough covers it well, and the voice is perfect for it. And then the other one that I would say is just because it's important has some significance to me, though I don't want to keep bringing up Churchill. I guess it's unavoidable in a situation like this. Martin Gilbert wrote a book called Churchill and the Jews, A Lifelong Friendship. And the significance to me personally is just that, Martin Gilbert was Churchill's biographer and also a mensch. And very early in my career, I wrote a column about how the early Jewish Yishuv settlers had a choice to make about how to present themselves to Churchill when he showed up to see what they were doing with British, money and favors and all that. And Martin Gilbert's book describes it very well. It's a very good scene, and it's very significant to the future of the conflict. But also, I wrote I was writing this column as, the editor of a local Jewish paper. And I sent an email to Martin Gilbert just saying, I'm writing this. I think I have it right. What you're saying here, let me know if I have it wrong and if you want to add anything. And I didn't necessarily expect to hear back, but he not only wrote back, Martin Gilbert, but he included in his note to me a page from the draft of the book with his hand-made corrections so that I could see the story that I was telling as Martin Gilbert was refining it and developing it in his brain, what he started with, how he got to telling the final version of the story. And I thought, this is the most generous thing I could possibly imagine. I was a nobody, but even if I weren't, the time that he took out to do this. So that has always just, had a certain meaning to me. Martin Gilbert's Churchill and the Jews. So Churchill and the Jews and David McCullough's Truman.
Yeah. I mean, Martin Gilbert was, again, another one of these figures you can't really believe that he did what he did and produced what he produced. Just an extraordinary life of accomplishment, not only as Churchill's authorized biographer and the work that he did and the papers that he collated, a job that he died in the midst of, and that our friend Larry Arnn, who is the president of Hillsdale College, has continued to basically assemble every single word that Churchill, who is obviously, I think, the most prolific writer among world leaders who ever lived. That project is still ongoing. I think it's reached its 23rd or 24th volume, and Churchill isn't even in his late 70s yet in the course of that project, but Gilbert's also his work as a pioneering historian of Zionism, and again the kindness that he showed you, just amazing, an amazing figure in his own right, probably worthy of a biography or two himself. Abe, what you got?
So, like Christine and Matt, I don't read a whole lot of biographies. I used to, but I suffer from a very poor memory in terms of my long-term memory. Any media that I consume past, 5 years ago is kind of lost to me, which is nice in that I can read it all over again and enjoy it all over again, but terrible in that I don't retain important things, even however into them I am at the time. So I have to go post my last reset but it's okay because there's a great biography. Mine is a literary biography, and it's Zachary Leader's 2-volume The Life of Saul Bellow. The first volume came out in 2016. The second volume came out in 2019.
You wrote for it. You wrote about it.
I wrote it. Yeah, that's right. So if you want to follow this up, you can check out my review of it of this at Commentary. Bellow, who died in 2005. The two books together are about 1,500, 1,600 pages. But part of why this was an obvious choice is I had never read so much in so short a time as I did when I read these two back to back. And it's a fantastic book, first of all, because it's so comprehensive. Leader speaks to everyone that there's left to speak to. He has all the papers, all the letters, all the correspondence, all the abandoned drafts of the novels. But it's a fascinating book because it really breathes life into a whole intellectual universe, or intellectual universes, through the universes through which Bellow traveled. And this has to do with ideas about art and literature and politics and a lot of mysticism, and religion, and Bellow's ideas about America. And it really shows Bellow as the undeniable sort of genius and singly focused literary genius that he was from an early. And one of the fascinating things about Bellow's life and the way it's nailed down in these books is that, very early on in Chicago, Bellow fell in with this wildly precocious group of intellectuals that he almost sort of like, moved through his life as if that were the world. He continued to sort of live and breathe and swim in that kind of heady place. And it's also very juicy because Bellow was a serial philanderer, and his marriages are a disaster, and he would always use them on the page, and so you get to see what real life Bellow figure was, what character, and so on. And it covers him for the good, the ill, and the foolish. He could be quite foolish in his meanderings and his obstinacy, and on a few spiritual matters. And it was just a tremendously engrossing book, and it didn't feel like 1,600 pages. So that's The Life of Saul Bellow by Zachary Leader. Both volumes,
okay.
I would say.
Okay, so I mostly read literary biographies, but I have one non-literary biography that I found absolutely astonishing, and that a doorstop, another doorstop. The First Tycoon by T.J. Stiles, which is the life of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was, in many respects, the most important, aside from Abraham Lincoln, the most important American of the 19th century. The man who built, in many ways, can be said to have built the modern America as the most visionary figure in the idea that Americans needed to be able to move. They needed to be able to spread themselves across the continent. He started out as a kid on Staten Island, a ferry boy, built ferries himself, learned by degrees how to run things like ferries in ways that would mean that they would not explode with 1,500 people on board because you put the firewood or the hay too close to the flame, something that apparently never occurred to anybody before, learning by doing. And then, of course, built one of the key figures in building the railroads. He became the richest man in the world, and helped guide the arrival of the United States as the leading economic power that the world had ever seen. It's an astonishing book, The First Tycoon by T.J. Stiles. But I did want to mention that the biography that I read in my life that has meant the most to me, is a literary portrait in biography of Leo Tolstoy by the French writer Henri Troyat, which is called Tolstoy. And Troyat writes this biography. It's obviously entirely secondary sources. He writes it with Tolstoy as the leading character in a kind of nonfiction novel. And his great insight following along the famous crack of Isaiah Berlin that there are hedgehogs and there are foxes, and that a hedgehog knows one thing and a fox knows many things, and that Dostoevsky was a hedgehog and that Tolstoy was a fox who wanted to be a hedgehog. Tolstoy knew everything, but he was very eager to believe in one thing, one big thing, and that this tension dominated his life. And the great insight of Troyat's biography is that Tolstoy was a character out of Dostoevsky. That Tolstoy himself, the way he lived his life, the way he treated his family, his extraordinary existential struggles as a religious figure, as a writer who wanted to be a religious figure, and all of that make him really a character that only Dostoevsky could have thought up. And this then brings to mind also, Matt, you mentioned Leon Edel's biography of Henry James. There is another great 20th century biography in multiple volumes of a literary figure, and that's Joseph Frank's, I think, 5-volume biography of Dostoevsky, who led easily the most dramatic life of any great writer, a man who was 3 people away from being killed by a firing squad for being a revolutionary opponent of the regime in Russia, when the horse came with the commutation of the sentences of the people who were being taken to the firing squad. The person ahead of him in line went stark raving insane. He ended up in the precursor to the Gulag, which was the source of his first great book, From the Land of the Dead. And then, compulsive gambler, complex literary figure, terrible anti-Semite, but the greatest novelist of humans, the person who looked the deepest and the most darkly into the human soul. And Frank captures this unbelievable life with incredible detail and clarity. But that is not that it is not the lovable, or like, I don't know what you would even call it, sort of like the transcendent kind of book that Troyat's biography, that's Troyat, Henri Troyat's biography of Tolstoy is. I have one more just to add, again, because the life is so fantastic and her evocation of the life is so fantastic, is Claire Tomalin's biography of Charles Dickens. Dickens, again, was a fascinating figure that we could almost compare today to somebody like Woody Allen. Here's why. So Dickens was the greatest literary celebrity of Victorian England. He was like, combine, Stephen King and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg into one person. And that is who Charles Dickens was to the mid-century, 19th century Brits. And man, he had 10 children. He'd grown up. He'd spent some time in a debtor's prison. He started magazines. He wrote dozens of novels. He was world famous by the time he was 22 or 23. And then in 1858, out of nowhere, he dumps his wife and he takes on a lover who is a 17 or 18-year-old girl who is never seen in public, Kate Turner, and he, under the laws of Victorian London at the time, not only does he ditch his wife, throw her out, is incredibly nasty to her, but he retains full custody of the children, because that is how the law worked in England at the time. And he was very, very cruel to his children, none of whom, again, in this freakish way that you see these geniuses who come out of nowhere like Dickens, none of whom had a tenth of what he had. Like, he had these kids whom he had to sort of make provision for, and they were all very unimpressive. Here he came out of nowhere, the greatest prose stylist in the English language who had ever lived, who had sort of totally educated himself and did this thing. And then he had these kids who were all just sort of like regular, ordinary people. It's like he came out of nowhere, exploded onto the world, and the disappointment that his moral failings represented to the people who knew him, to the people who worshipped him, to the people who thought so well of him. Claire Tomlin evokes this really, really wonderfully well in this in her biography. So let's go through our list here. So we've got Matt's choice. We've got Matt's choice of Paul Johnson's
Churchill
biography
and
of Churchill.
Leon Edel's Henry James.
Right. Seth, you have
David McCullough's Truman, and Martin Gilbert, Churchill and the Jews.
right. Abe, you've got Zachary Leader's
Life of Saul Bellow. Yeah.
right. Christina's had to jump off. So because unlike Abe, I have no short-term memory, but I only have long-term memory. I as of speaking, I can't remember.
Lewis's biography
Of course,
Edith Wharton.
R.W. Lewis. Yes.
and his short biography of Dante for Penguin Lives.
Yes. The first co-written by David Milch, and the fact that I didn't even remember that this is, again,
You
Abe
commented on it.
It's
Yes.
Here's what's interesting is that Abe and I make one person, because he has no short-term memory and I have no long-term memory, and
One amnesiac person.
excuse me, he has only short-term memory and I have only long-term
Right.
memory. And then
It's good that you found each other.
Yeah.
I recommended T.J. Styles's The First Tycoon about Cornelius Vanderbilt, Henri Troyat's Tolstoy, Joseph Frank's 5-volume biography of Fyodor Dostoevsky.
There is a one-volume version of the Frank.
Is there? Oh,
Yes.
okay. So like Edel, I
like
didn't know
with
that.
Edel, yeah. So
okay.
for people who don't want, to
Right.
spend
Although
a
each
year.
of those volumes is actually short, unlike Edel.
Right.
It's like each of Frank's volumes is 250 pages. So to be fair to him, he didn't produce 5,000 pages. Edel's, each of his volumes is enormous. And Claire Tomlin's biography of Charles Dickens, which is, I believe, called Charles Dickens. Anyway, so that is our biography show, giving you some stuff to read over the summer. We'll be back with more for Abe, Christine, Seth, and Matt. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.